Fears grow as Omicron spreads across the globe. Are we heading for another lethal coronavirus wave, or can the world keep this troubling mutation at bay? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is Omicron. Just a few weeks ago, the Delta variant was the biggest concern in our battle to beat the coronavirus. Now we're dealing with Omicron, a new and potentially more dangerous mutation. Scientists fear the strain is far more transmissible, and cases of it can already be found around the world. As of Friday, at least 23 countries had confirmed cases, and South Africa, which first discovered the mutation, has been hit with an unprecedented rise in infections in a very short time. In less than a week, new cases went from less than 3,000 a day to more than 11,500. But while the Omicron variant appears to spread more easily, its symptoms appear to be mild, leading some to say it is too early to panic.
Certainly, in this early stage, the news does look to be promising. The great majority of the breakthrough infection, in other words, individuals that have had infection despite vaccination, is mild. Our hospital surveillance is showing a little bit of an uptick, but certainly nothing as dramatic as we've seen in the previous waves. So it does portend well, but I think it still is early days. You know, we have only had this virus around for, just over a week. So I think we really need to watch the space.
But while some are hopeful, others are hugely concerned. Once the mutation was discovered, dozens of countries imposed travel restrictions to help stop the spread. But Omicron is already global. How quickly it spreads further remains to be seen, but scientists in South Africa warn the variant could have a higher rate of repeat infections. But they are still confident vaccines will protect us from serious illness. And EU Chief Ursula von der Leyen says it's time to start talking about mandatory vaccinations.
It is understandable and appropriate to lead this discussion now. How we can encourage and potentially think about mandatory vaccination within the European Union. This needs discussion. This needs a common approach, but it is a discussion that I think has to be led.
But while the bloc deals with vaccine hesitancy and rolling out booster shots, most of the rest of the world is still waiting for its first dose. About 45% of the global population is vaccinated. Most, however, live in wealthy nations. Let's take a look at the numbers. Now, the UK and Germany have fully vaccinated almost 70% of their populations. Italy, 73%. And Spain has given at least 2 doses to 80% of the country. But in Africa, far fewer have had their shots. Less than 2% of Nigeria is fully vaccinated. In Ethiopia, it's 1.3%. South Africa fares much better with a quarter of its population vaccinated, but still nowhere near enough. Well, the WHO has repeatedly warned that nobody is safe until everyone is safe. But vaccines are clearly not being distributed fairly, and the African Union's Vaccine Delivery Alliance says the Omicron variant may be the result of that inequality.
The inconsiderate and isolationist behavior of global North has created the current situation. And until they are held accountable, I'm afraid Omicron may just be the beginning.
So is it anyone's guess just how the world should best respond now, and what are the risks of getting it wrong? Joining me to discuss that from Pittsburgh is Dr. Amesh Adalja, a senior scholar at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security and a specialist in infectious diseases. From San Francisco, we have Jake Glanville, the founder and CEO of Centivax. He also featured in the Netflix documentary Pandemic: How to Prevent an Outbreak. And from London, Oksana Pyzik, a lecturer at the University College London School of Pharmacy. Thanks all so much for being with us. Let me start by getting each of your assessments of Omicron today. It's been just over a week, I know, still early days, but Dr. Adalja, what do you make of this mutation right now, as well as the measures that have been taken in response?
Well, I think there's still a lot more questions than there are answers. But what we know is that this is a variant of the virus that harbors a lot of mutations that have been associated with evasion from some of the protection from vaccines and monoclonal antibodies, and potentially increased transmissibility. And you couple that with an increase in cases in South Africa And that makes this something of concern. And I say concern, but not panic. And I think that's an important distinction, because what we're learning in the early days from South Africa and the clinical conditions of the patients that are being diagnosed other places is that it does seem, yes, this can cause breakthrough infections at a more frequent rate than other variants have. But it seems that the vaccine is able to do what matters, protect you against serious illness, hospitalization, and death. And when it comes to the response, I've been disappointed in the United States response, primarily because they have resorted to very blunt tools like travel bans, which we know are ineffectual and cause a lot of damage. And that didn't stop the Omicron variant from coming to the United States. And we indeed have community spread in New York State. So that really just kind of distorted how people thought about this and kind of took us back to the early days of the pandemic, when this is November or December of 2021, where we've got so much more tools, so much more knowledge. So we're not helpless against this variant.
Okay, let me ask you to expand on that, though, quickly. I mean, are the travel bans fully ineffectual? Because some argue, yes, they won't stop the spread, but they can halt it. And it is better safe than sorry.
I don't think that it makes a meaningful difference, because what you end up having to do is having to weigh the pluses and the minuses of these travel bans. And I think that the travel bans give people a false sense of security. It then ends up punishing countries like those Southern African countries where this variant was discovered, because now what's the incentive for them to be transparent and report the discovery of another variant if what they get is punishment? And then you're hearing that, for example, in South Africa, they're having difficulties getting the reagents to do the experiments that we so desperately need the answers to. All of this is just kind of the wrong way to do it, especially now in November, December of 2021, when we have much better tools. We have tests, we have vaccines, we have antivirals on the cusp. We know so much more about which types of transmission risks are high and low. So to me, this was kind of a return to the bad old days when people were using blunt tools and sort of ignored everything that we've learned in the past 2 years about this virus and how to do things without having to have this cascading negative impact and collateral damage from whatever our public health action is.
Okay, Jake, are you on the same page?
I'll tell you the reason why nations reacted the way they did. And that is that this virus has an unprecedented amount of mutation in the spike that it uses to infect you, and particularly enriched right where we know almost all neutralizing antibodies bind. We're still waiting over the next week to see some results on those neutralizing antibodies, but the concern is that it could have significant immune escape. And in the worst case scenario, it could be co-circulating with Delta if they are completely immune escaped from each other. And so for that reason, there was a decision by multiple nations to impose travel bans to try to understand, to provide some defense measures while we determine the level of transmissibility, whether it's equally severe in disease process, and the level of immune evasion. Now, I agree that this is a dangerous policy to punish nations that reveal the presence of a new variant, because the effect of that is that many nations will choose not to test. I think that really needs to be addressed through policy to provide financial support to nations that are undergoing these sorts of measures. But the truth is it will slow but not stop transmission. We've already seen that that's taken place globally. But that slowing can be important. We know that there's about 100 days between when Pfizer can create a new Omicron-adapted vaccine in a period where we need to learn a lot more about the severity and transmission capabilities. And measures that can slow the spread have the benefit of being able to provide you a little bit more time to get there. I'm not trying to understate the problems South Africa and other nations will face as a consequence of these bans. The other advantage is it gives more time to scale up surveillance, which currently is deficient.
Okay. Oksana, I saw you agreed with a couple points. Let me ask you this, though. You know, we heard scientists before, when you and I actually spoke, that scientists needed just a few more weeks really to assess how dangerous or not the new variant could be. Are we going to have those kinds of solid answers? Because both of our panelists, other panelists agree we don't really know how this variant is going to behave. Was it a little too optimistic to say we'll have most of the answers in a few weeks' time?
I think that we'll definitely be able to understand the degree of vaccine escape once we're able to test against the sera of patients who have been vaccinated or previously infected. So that will take some time, but I do think that it's a realistic time frame, just given the sheer amount of energy and resources being poured into understanding the Omicron puzzle. So In that time, though, there is even in a pandemic, a week is a very long time. We saw that, particularly wave one in the UK, where it was one of the last countries compared to Europe to lock down. The excess mortality rates in that first wave were significantly more than elsewhere. So speed is everything. So if it's a couple of weeks, that's a big gap in terms of trying to catch up.
Interesting. I'll tell you what, Dr. Amesh Adalja, let's try to look at the potential silver lining and what really are the chances that this variant could prove that the pandemic has already run the worst of its course. You know, that COVID symptoms will get milder and milder because the virus is weakening and becoming something like a flu that we can all learn to live with. You know, so far it needs to be said that no deaths have really been associated with Omicron.
It's a little bit premature to say that for sure, because we don't have enough data, enough clinical data to be able to say that, because there may be some surveillance bias in who's getting infected. For example, people in South Africa that may be getting infected are younger. They tend to not have severe disease to begin with. So we've got to wait. But I do find the fact reassuring that when you do see the data from South Africa, what you're hearing about is those that are requiring hospitalization tend to not be vaccinated, which tells me that the vaccine is doing what it's meant to do: stop serious disease, hospitalization, and death. You have to remember that COVID is not going to be eradicated. It's not going to be eliminated. Our goal is to tame it, make it more like other respiratory viruses we deal with year in and year out. And there is some suggestion that viruses like this that spread efficiently through the respiratory route are going to have evolutionary pressure, push them towards better transmissibility, better escape of immune system, and with more transmissibility resulting, and then less severe symptoms. We have 4 other coronaviruses that cause 25% of our common colds. There's a hypothesis that a 19th century pandemic was caused by a coronavirus. So this may be a suggestion of this. I think we still need a lot more data to be able to say that definitively, but I'm reassured by the fact that we're not seeing serious illness, especially in vaccinated people, that the breakthroughs tend to be mild. That's a good thing.
Right. Let me ask you what we actually do then with the unvaccinated. You know, we're hearing many people call this the pandemic of the unvaccinated now, but how much are they really putting the rest of us at risk?
Primarily, the issue with the unvaccinated is that they, especially if they are high risk for hospitalization, they end up getting infected, especially with more contagious variants like Delta around. And then they require hospital care. And then hospitals have to worry about capacity. And if you go to the hospital, and I work in the hospital all the time, the people that you take care of that have COVID now are, the vast majority are unvaccinated. And if you're in an area where there is a large population of unvaccinated individuals who have high risk conditions for hospitalization, they can crush a hospital. So that's the issue that I have now with the unvaccinated, is that they continue to impinge on hospital resources, take away ICU beds for people who might have a stroke or a heart attack. And we don't have endless capacity in hospitals. So that's the problem, is that the unvaccinated allow this virus to still kill at a rate that it shouldn't be. In the United States, our deaths now are all vaccine preventable. It's really a tragedy that more people have died in the last year than in the earlier eras of the pandemic, when we didn't have vaccines, when we didn't have monoclonal antibodies.
Right. Let me ask you very quickly then, I mean, is South Africa, do you think, given that more than 75% of its population is not vaccinated, are they doing the right thing by not taking any further restrictions right now, not locking down, even though it is peak travel season and the holiday season is approaching in just a few weeks?
It all depends on which tools they are using. So I don't think that lockdowns should be the first answer that everybody uses for COVID-19. I think it should be the last answer when everything else has failed. And I do think that using rapid tests, deploying monoclonal antibodies, increasing vaccination status based on the epidemiology of what's going on, where are the cases occurring, who are they occurring in, what does hospital capacity look like? That's how I think you should gauge the public health response. And I think that there's a reflex to go to lockdowns, but I don't think that the negative consequences of lockdowns often justify what occurs, because there's better ways to do this. We can be precision guided. We know where transmission risks are higher. We know where transmission risks are lower, and we have tools to do this safely, including using rapid tests.
Okay. Jake, if you had a comment, go ahead. If not, I wanted to ask you about something else related.
So, yeah, one thing I wanted to add, which I agree with many of the points being made, the other reason why we need to vaccinate the world is that the virus mutates as it infects new people. And so the extent to which we have not vaccinated everyone, we're giving the virus more fodder. to infect more people, and therefore we're accelerating the rate that new variants pop up. That's a significant global advantage to have a vaccinated population that slows the rate of new variant creation, because we will otherwise continue to run into this problem every 4 or 5 months at a faster rate.
Quickly on that, Jake, before I move on, I mean, when you see countries like Germany make, vaccination basically mandatory, I mean, or at least make life so inconvenient for those who are not vaccinated that it feels mandatory, is that a good thing?
Well, it's complicated. We have significant political resistance in the United States to mandatory vaccination, but as a pragmatist, you look at how far we got with voluntary vaccination, and it's good, but in most nations, it's not enough. During that period where people were voluntarily vaccinating, we have gained a lot of information about the safety, and we have increased the immune protection of the populations. But now we're in a position where we have, at least in the developed world, enough vaccine for everyone, and there's a tapering off of people who are willing to receive it. And we haven't approached any level of approximating herd immunity in most regions. And so the vaccine mandates serve that purpose of reducing the number of people who attend a hospital, reducing the rate of transmission. They aren't perfect solutions, and I agree with the assessment that eradication is extremely unlikely, but they do reduce the rate of creating new variants, slowing the spread of the virus in a population and reducing the impact on hospitals. And so for that reason, I think in practice, if you have enough vaccine, I think there are strong arguments for mandates.
Right. A blunt question then, if you were king, would you make it mandatory in the U.S.?
Yes, I would.
Okay. Fair enough. Oksana, I'll move on to the next train of thought with you. And I'd like all of our panelists really to comment on this. The Spanish flu wreaked havoc on the globe. It ran a 2-year cycle with no vaccine. It killed between about 17 and 100 million people. Still, the numbers are not certain, but 17 and 100 million people when the world population was much smaller. We have just over 5 million dead from COVID, with a huge global population of over 7 billion. Is there any inspiration to be taken from that in how the world has managed this pandemic and whether it will actually be over soon?
Well, I think a lot will come out of what we find out from the mutations around Omicron, to what extent that a next wave could spread around the world. We do have now more tools. So as a previous panelist had mentioned, lockdown is the type of tool you use when you don't have as many vaccines available, or when you have low vaccine uptake in a population. So if we look at the pandemic treaty that the World Health Organization is now negotiating with member states and world leaders, it's precisely to take those lessons learned throughout the last 2 years and try to action them into something that's more robust and legally binding, which is a bit tricky. We know that both China and Russia are a bit nervous about an instrument that is legally binding in this case, because it could then look at the data sharing, ensuring that happens much more fastly, as well as giving access to outbreak sites. So although I think that the vaccine is certainly the way to help reduce the effects of this virus, we know that it's not going to go away. It'll become endemic, but the goal is to reduce the number of people who end up hospitalized. So the quicker that we can get that vaccine to not just high-income countries, but to everywhere, and look at supporting the U.S. That is currently trying to negotiate IP waivers with the World Trade Organization, so that these barriers to vaccine manufacturing can be lifted. That means we'll get out of it faster, but we have more tools now: the antivirals, the vaccines themselves. Right. And now in the US, very late, 2 years in, finally rapid tests will be available at home, which here in the UK you can get at any pharmacy for free, and is often a requirement to either go to work, or even here at UCL in London at our university, our students need to take them to go to class. So these are some of the public health packages we're talking about.
Still, though, I mean, we're at the 2-year point, really, or very close to. Amesh, let me ask you, I mean, if we look at the last pandemic on this scale, respiratory-related global pandemic, Do you feel better about where I'm trying to be, as I said, optimistic? Should we feel a bit better about how we have managed the coronavirus in this almost 2-year period, given that 5 million people out of a global population of almost more than 7 billion have died? Have we done well, and are we still going to do well, given all the tools that are available now?
It depends on what part of the pandemic response you're trying to evaluate. I would say that the development of vaccines within less than a year using a novel technology is completely breathtaking. And I think a testament to the power of science and scientists to actually use their minds to solve a problem. We have antivirals that have been developed. We've got monoclonal antibodies. We've got rapid tests in people's homes. All of that is something that I think we can be proud of. I mean, it should have happened faster. There were so many other mistakes. But in terms of the scientific response, I think it's been nothing less than extraordinary. This is something that people in 1918 couldn't even imagine. They didn't even know that influenza was caused by a virus in 1918. So we do have tremendous tools. But when it comes to where we faltered, I think it really has to do with the decision making and the politics getting injected into this pandemic that have really magnified the death toll. Like I said, the deaths that are occurring now in the United States today, those are vaccine preventable. And they're likely due to the fact that politics has been injected into people's decision whether or not to take the vaccine. So when we look back at this pandemic, it's a success story for science, but it is a failing grade for the policymakers and politicians who did not actually heed warnings, took the wrong actions, took actions too late, and then used this pandemic for political purpose and created a divisive society all around the world, especially in the United States, where people decide whether or not they want the vaccine based on what tribe they belong to, rather than what the actual science says. So I think it's a plus and a minus, depending on how you look.
Interesting. Jake, kind of from your American base there, in such an interesting state like California, Oksana had alluded to the fact that it seems some people are getting, especially the anti-vaxxer camp, is getting a bit too comfortable with the idea of antivirals being developed very soon to give them even more reason to not have to vaccinate. I mean, what do you see as the danger in that? Why, help us understand really why vaccination really is the only kind of answer to ending this finally.
Sure. So I think what we're experiencing in the United States is not unique to the United States. It's happening in many other states of the world. And it comes down to, we're encountering a distrust in science, right, in the period where science can't help us. And so I think greater communication is necessary. When we look at those who are vaccine hesitant, the loudest ones are the ones who are, driven by hoaxes and some kind of very bizarre statements about vaccines causing various injuries that they just don't. But I think the majority of people that are vaccine hesitant in the United States, at least, they either just don't like being told what to do, or there's a large group of people who are unsure of what to believe about the science because they're hearing conflicting reports. And I think a better process of communication would be helpful for them. As we move forward, I think really epidemiologists and the medical practice needs to do a better job of being transparent and effectively communicating in a clear, coherent manner the merits and the limitations of the science, because I think there's a level of distrust in some of these individuals because they don't feel that they're getting the full picture, or they feel that they're getting conflicting messaging. And to speak to the previous point, I think we were very successful in vaccine creation. I agree. I think where we faltered was we need a pandemic treaty. We had so many nations that were responding very differently. They didn't have a cohesive response. There is no compensation mechanism like disaster relief funds to a nation under lockdown. And there was no central empowered messaging from a single place with the best collection of scientists that were able to broadcast where we were, and that gave rise to chaos. And so I think addressing that goes a long way towards people gaining comfort around the medicines and the vaccines that we have available.
Okay. We just actually have time for one last question. Dr. Adalja, let me ask you quickly. We've been hearing now that we might actually need an entirely new vaccine for the Omicron variant. Just give us an idea of what the scenarios could be in the upcoming weeks. When will we actually know if we do need that new vaccine? What are the best and worst case scenarios?
Probably in the next week or two, we will start to get information from those neutralization assays, those tests that they're doing on people's antibodies and this Omicron variant, and understand what level of immune escape is occurring. I think if any variant has come close to crossing a threshold to update the vaccine, it's probably the Omicron variant based on the mutations that it has and the reinfection rates we're hearing about and the breakthrough rates. So that's going to color this decision. But I also think we have to take a step back and ask what the goals are. Is the goal to prevent hospitalization, or is it to prevent every case? And I think that's going to also play a role, because if our vaccines, the current ones, are holding up against serious disease, there's going to be less of a priority to update the vaccine because we're trying to prevent serious illness. However, I do think as we move to an endemic phase and second generation vaccines, improved vaccines that come closer to what we call sterilizing immunity, maybe because they create antibodies in the nose as well, so that you don't even get mild breakthrough infections, ones that are more universal and target more coronaviruses, those are going to happen. But this is going to be, I think, a difficult decision and a threshold to cross, because once it's crossed, I think it's going to be hard to go back. But again, it's still a little bit premature to say whether or not this is going to happen. But of all the variants, this is the one that I feel is most likely to cause companies to cross that threshold and make a reformulated vaccine.
Okay, fascinating. Unfortunately, we're completely out of time. I'd really like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us on this very interesting discussion. Our viewers, of course, for being with us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter @_Newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.